In the previous lecture, we discussed the methods of quality check on government candidates and 8 different methods of observations. So those methods aim to allow the leader to identify virtuous and suitable candidates. Now, once the leader has identified virtuous and suitable candidates, the next thing to do is to obtain them. So this is the focus of this lecture. Now, in the teaching of the governing principle, we find 4 general principles of attracting great candidates. Okay, and the first principle is attracting with benevolence. Attracting with benevolence. Now, this may, sound obvious. I mean, after all, who doesn't want to work for a benevolent leader, right? But still, it is nonetheless important to understand the mechanism. From a perspective of human nature, people simply value spiritual fulfillment very much. At the shallow level, this spiritual fulfillment can be, substituted by financial reward. Apparently, no one will want to work if he is not properly compensated. But at the deeper level, people are more concerned about the mental reward and the spiritual atmosphere of the workplace. This is actually a very interesting issue. Before becoming an academic, I used to work in a very financially rewarding profession, and the money is usually the biggest factor that attracts candidates. And some applicants, especially those who don't have a lot of money, would say that they don't care about the working environment as long as they are accepted. So, when they first got the job, they were all dancing and singing. But after a few months, the ardor cools, and it seems that the marginal excitement of money has diminished. And instead, they started complaining about the working environment. So some of them stay on because the money is still good, but some others leave the job and switch to something more mentally fulfilling. Well, I'm not saying that there is anything wrong with making money, of course. My point is, money alone is not enough to secure a good candidate. And I think deep down, people look for mental fulfillment. In the short term, the mental fulfillment may be overshadowed by the excitement brought by financial reward, but in the long term, the emptiness from the spiritual side, start to kick in. And that's when the leader loses good employees. Volume 40, as you can see, Volume 40 of the Governing Principles suggests that a good government can show benevolence and virtue in his workplace. Then even people from very far away will travel long distance to join the leader. But if the government shows selfishness and unfairness, then even the most intimate employees will choose to leave. So compared to, financial compensation, benevolence is more about retaining talented employees in the long term, particularly if the employee is highly virtuous and has very high moral standard. This is because highly virtuous employees put much more weight on the virtue of the employer when evaluating the quality of the job. Now, there are many examples and cases in history where the ruler achieved diplomatic peace simply through their moral influence. For example, the Duke of Zhou was well known for his reverence paid to the ancestors. And this reverence was transformed into his respect paid to everyone, both domestic and foreign. And this quality alone was sufficient to attract people from the neighboring state to submit to him and lead to peace. And no military force was needed to achieve peace. In contrast, King Zhou of Shang disregarded ethics. So not only was he abandoned by his most loyal ministers, but also his brothers. Now, why would the ministers leave him? Didn't they worry about their job and official salary? Of course they did. But they couldn't bear to remain in an environment of cruelty and lack of morality. Although we say that benevolence is an abstract topic, there are some practical methods to promote benevolence and morality in attracting virtuous employees. The first method is to simply reduce the sole emphasis on financial reward. Now, under the setting of government work, this means the government should enlighten the candidate with a sense of mission and the spirit of public service. Likewise, under the setting of companies, non-financial reward include employee development, mental health, social responsibilities, and so on. Now, our viewers may wonder, is there any conflict between companies' profit-taking and non-financial goals? The answer is no. Well, clearly, financial growth is made by men and the use of capital, whereas capital is also operated by men. So the capital includes, both physical capital like machines and equipment, as well as intellectual capital such as research output and work ethics. So all of these qualities will eventually lead to financial performance and reward in the long term. So human capital really is fundamental to government and companies or enterprises. High quality human capital is not only measured by knowledge or degree certificates, but also by virtue. And in fact, virtue is more important than skills, because a virtuous person will be willing to learn new skills, but an unvirtuous person with skills may pose threat to the integrity of the organization. So without a moral benchmark, a great company can be destroyed by immoral business conduct. And we have seen the cases of Enron and a few trading and investment companies during the financial crisis. For a government, immoral conduct will lead to conflict within the government and inefficiency of government operation. Now, attracting candidates using financial reward alone also has another negative consequence. That is, their movement is solely determined by money, but with very little sense of loyalty and a sense of mission. The reason is an employee solely attracted by financial reward can be easily attracted away by a better financial reward elsewhere. Now, the second method of attracting with benevolence is to improve the leader's self-cultivation. So different from the first method, the second method emphasizes on the source of morality at the workplace, which is the leader himself or herself. But similar to the first method, this also relies on the fact that different people are attracted by different things. And more specifically, people with different level of morality will have different weight allocation between financial reward and the leader's virtue when they make career decision. According to to volume 40 of the Governing Principles, a person who hates immoral behavior and is ethically superior simply cannot be attracted by remuneration and position alone. And a person with very high integrity and strong self-control simply cannot be threatened. And the only way for the leader to achieve some kind of sympathy with these candidates is through respect, propriety, and self-cultivation. So I think it is an important point here, because most of the time we find that organizations put far more effort in advertising the working environment. Typically the advertisement mentions about a friendly working environment, flexible working hours, work-life balance, personal space, equal opportunity, and skill training, etc. Well, these are all very desirable features of a good workplace, but there's very little mentioning about the personal characteristics of the management team. The management mentioned here is not, limited to the top management, but also departmental heads down the hierarchy as well. And so the problem with, an overemphasis on the physical or external work environment while ignoring the personal cultivation of the leaders is that the virtuous candidate may not be fully utilized, even if they are recruited. The reason is, if the leader doesn't constantly improve his own moral awareness and practice ethics, his judgment about a person may be masked. In Lecture 3, we had extensive discussion about the relationship between the leader's moral incompetency and the inefficiency in HR management. So we will not repeat it here, but please refresh your memory at your own pace. Now, the third method of attracting with benevolence is that the leader should give full recognition to morally superior people and reach out to them. You see, this is extremely important because it leads to a major benefit, and that benefit is that being close to morally superior people can reduce the chance of making fatal mistakes. Morally superior people are willing to give tough advice to the leader, right? We have mentioned this in many occasions that, ancient sages, kings welcome advice and criticism, and they even set up specific posts for advice and criticism. And morally superior people are willing to put the benefit of the country or the organization before personal well-being. And they are more willing to be vigilant about the leader's personal conduct. Now, during the recruitment process, there is an important issue about the so-called conflict of interest in recruitment. I think we've all heard about this. And this can mean many things. One potential conflict of interest is that the leader should avoid recruiting someone from his own close circle because this gives the potential power abuse and unfair treatment. Meanwhile, it also seems to be a common sense to avoid someone with whom the leader had conflict in the past, because it can be an impediment to a good working relationship. Well, the governing principles recognize this problem, the conflict of interest issue, but suggest to maintain an open mind to the candidates. It says close relative should not be banned from candidature, nor should the opponents be banned from candidature. The only criteria should be his or her level of virtue. So what does that mean? Well, a benevolent leader should focus only on the ability and the virtue of the candidate, and not to waste a good candidate or a minister just because of the uniqueness of the relationship. A benevolent leader attracts, equally benevolent candidates. And these candidates should be able to self-control and refrain from wrongdoing. And meanwhile, these candidates can also understand the fact that, their virtue is so highly valued by the leader, and it is high enough to overshadow the worries of potential conflict of interest. And this fact should also motivate the candidate to maintain his moral high ground. So that's the first principle. Now, the second principle is attracting with respect and rights or proprieties. So respect and rights or propriety is about how we treat people. Now, when people interact with each other, people follow the principle of reciprocity, which is about action and reaction. The way others treat us depend on how we treat them, and respect and rights are the practical guideline of human interaction. Although it goes without saying that we should treat people with respect and propriety, it's particularly important if the leader wants to recruit suitable candidates. As compared to financial reward, people value more about how much their personal existence is valued. When people are valued and respected, okay, they have a strong sense of gratitude and loyalty. And this is part of human nature. The Spring and Autumn Annals suggest that a truly superior person would always repay the gratitude of his patron, okay, even risking their own well-being to help and advise the patron. So at the place of work, this patron is the leader. The governing principle document a conversation between Yu Rang and his friends. Okay, now Yu Rang was an officer of a few noble families, and one day his friend said to him, "You have served as the great official for the Fan family, the Zhonghang family, and the Zhi family, the three different families." Okay, but after Fan and Zhonghang families were eliminated by the feudal lords, you never sought to avenge for them. But when the Zhi family was eliminated, you vowed to avenge for them. What's the reason? Well, Yu Rang replied, "The Fan and Zhonghang family left me in hunger and cold and treated me like an outsider. I can only treat them as an outsider as well. But Zhi family was different. They made sure that I was well remunerated, respected, like a great official. I will treat them back equally." So this is a simple illustration of the principle of reciprocity. But I hope our viewers don't treat this lightly, thinking that this is no more than common sense. Most of the time, it is common sense that makes a huge difference. Now, let's ask an obvious question, shall we? Why should the leader respect the superior people? Why? Well, from the perspective of government work, superior people are not only an employee of the public sector, but also valuable to the country. The governing principles list three kinds of employees, namely a benevolent person, a wise person, and a learned scholar. And each has different level of contribution to the government. It says that a benevolent person is like a national treasure because they understand the key to harmonious human relation. When there is a confrontation within the government, they do not exacerbate the conflict out of private interest, but minimize the conflict. And this is extremely helpful for maintaining efficiency of the government. So that's a benevolent person. A wise employee in the government is described as a national asset. The national asset. They're able to see through complex issues, complex situations with their wit and calmness, and prevent foreign invasion. And they also do not stir up international conflict and invite turbulence. A learned scholar is someone who is not only knowledgeable but also has very high standard of morality. They're called the national nobility because they are able to educate the public. And their education is based on moral influence, and their teaching can harness the innate goodness of the people. Okay, so this is what makes a country noble in the long term. Not military power, not economic power, but the general elevation of morality among the people. So we can see that the superior people are so important to the country and the people that they deserve absolute respect in order to induce and motivate their contribution. And this is indeed the responsibility of the government. But in contrast, not respecting the virtuous people or ministers will induce loss to the country. And most of the time, these losses are not visible in the short term, but it can be felt quite strongly in the long term. For example, if a wise strategist is treated with despise, he would be reluctant to think for the government and devise ingenious plan. As a result, national security may be at risk. The governing principle also said that when an eloquent diplomat is treated with despise, he would be reluctant to embark on diplomatic mission or represent the country. And this would put unnecessary strain on foreign relation. On the battlefield, without the courageous men and women, battle would be lost and the country would be invaded. So again, as common sense as they may be, when it comes to country governance and indeed company management, it is simply very costly to ignore the dire consequence of losing the talented people. So I guess a natural takeaway from this part of the teaching is that the powerful and rich have much more to lose than the low and the poor, and they cannot afford to be proud and arrogant. Volume 43 of the Governing Principles has recorded an intriguing story about a person called Tian Zifang, who was one of the officers of the state of Wei. Okay, so one day the Duke of Wei was on his way to a place called Anyi. Okay, there's a place called Anyi with a team of officers and armies. And Tian Zifang was walking at the end of the line. The son of the Duke, who was the prince, of course, right? So the son of the Duke caught up from behind and met Tian Zifang. And Tian Zifang sat down and said to the young prince, bring my word to the Duke, ask him to wait for me in Chaoge. The young prince was a little bit upset by Tian Zifang's manner and said to him, "Oh, I don't know who is more arrogant, the poor or the rich." So Tian Zifang replied, "Well, apparently it is the poor. The rich cannot afford to treat the poor with arrogance. When a great official treats the people with pride and arrogance, he will lose his position. When a poor person acts with arrogance, the worst case is to stay poor and not much to lose." Well, interesting, isn't it? So after the prince passed on these comments to his father, the Duke of Wei said, "He's absolutely right. I am no match with Tian Zifang in benevolence and virtue. This is why I treat him with respect and propriety, and place him in a position as my friend. Ever since we became friends, our country's relation with neighboring states have never been stronger, and social harmony has never been higher." So from this story, we can see that the Duke of Wei had a great understanding of the source of his success and the importance of respecting the superior officers. And not only was he not angry about Tian Zifang's attitude towards his son, but he guided his son to respect superior people. Now, you might wonder why Tian Zifang has such attitude towards the prince. I mean, isn't a superior person supposed to be very humble and nice to everybody? Well, I think we need to broaden our mind and look at this holistically. Tian Zifang was a very able person, and he enabled the Duke of Wei to influence the neighboring states through virtue and benevolence. So it's impossible that Tian Zifang was a completely arrogant and rude person. In fact, his attitude towards the prince would not have been noticed if it were towards the common people. In other words, the prince had expected a much more respectful attitude from Tian Zifang because he was a royal. But the attitude he received was far below his expectation. Furthermore, Tian Zifang's attitude was a manifestation of the concept of equality, which says, "I only walk at my own pace, and the Duke will have to wait for me. I don't have to walk faster just because I am the subordinate." Now, the Duke of Zhou is another example, of a leader who shows complete respect to the virtuous people. And so when the Duke of Zhou taught his son about governance and the correct attitude towards the people, he said, there were times when I had to stop several times in the course of washing my hair, or stop several times in the course of eating, so that I could greet virtuous men who came by for a visit. So why did the Duke do that? Well, it's because, as he put it himself, I am afraid that I might have overlooked any virtuous men. So the mentality of the Duke of Zhou, you see, is quite remarkable. He was the son of King Wen, and he's the younger brother of King Wu. So he was in a very high position. He was not nobody. But the Duke was so cautious that he feared of losing the talented and superior candidates of the government. And that's why he was able to show the highest respect as a royal towards the ordinary people, right? Ordinary person. Now, the third principle is attracting with proper remuneration. So now you might wonder, hang on a minute, didn't we mention several times during this course that, remuneration is not the best thing to use to attract virtuous people? Well, that still holds, okay? So what's the purpose of this principle then? Well, we have to remember, the foundation of good governance is to have virtuous officials, right? But the pool of virtuous candidates may be limited, either because there are not enough candidates up to the standard, or simply because people don't know what the government wants. They don't know. They simply don't know whether or not the government is looking for virtuous candidate in the first place. So if the government doesn't value virtue as much as, let's say, social connection and power, it would be a waste of time for the virtuous candidate to offer their services. So this means that the government needs to send a signal to the potential candidate, right? A signal. Now, one way for the government to send a credible signal about its preference is by raising the living standard of a certain group of profession. In volume 34 of the Governing Principles, it says that when the government raises the income of riders, horse riders, it also raises the respect paid to the riders by the society. One, it is because of wealth, and two, it's because of the recognition from the government, isn't it? So this way, more people will be willing to learn to ride, and there will be more riders in the country. Likewise, if the government raises the living standard of virtuous people, their social position and respect would also increase, because now everyone admires the virtuous people, and they will self-cultivate and learn from the virtuous people, and there will be more virtuous people with high morality and ethical standard. And the result is, of course, a better pool of human resource. Now, if we use a modern example, okay, we can look at the relationship between the increasing number of students with finance degree and the salary level of finance professions. Investment bankers are very well paid. In the UK, the starting salary of graduate analyst in the investment banking industry is around twice the average graduate starting salary. So the government doesn't even have to make an effort, right, to attract young, smart graduate, such as myself, of course, to join the industry. That was a long time ago, by the way. Okay, and so every year there are more graduates applying for a job in the investment banking industry every year. So I guess the money speaks a universal language. So why not use remuneration in a more proactive and explicit way to promote virtue? Of course, virtue should be for the virtue's sake, right? It shouldn't be motivated by money. However, we have to wait for the society to be elevated to a certain level before virtue becomes a widely accepted goal of life. At this level, it would be a lot easier for people to self-cultivate under the influence of others, and there is no need for financial incentive. Now, the other side of the coin is inappropriate remuneration paid to the virtuous people. So insufficient remuneration not only does nothing to promote self-cultivation, but also sends a bad signal of lack of respect, right? So the net effect is negative. It's not zero. Is negative. The governing principles use the story of Song Yan to illustrate this point. Now, Song Yan was the prime minister of the state of Qi. And after he was, dismissed from the government, he returned to his official residence and asked all of his ministers to leave the country with him and find a different king to serve. Okay, so he wasn't happy. Okay, now to his surprise, no one responded. Nobody followed. And Song Yan was very disappointed, and he said, why is loyalty so difficult? So he was literally complaining, right? And one of his ministers, Chen Rao, said to Song Yan, well, it's not loyalty that's the problem. It is your method. For example, you paid very low salary to the officials, but you feed your animals and pets more than they could eat. That is your mistake number one, sir. You have so many fruit trees in your backyard and your women throw the fruits around for fun, but none of us has ever been invited to taste it. That's your mistake number two. You decorate your mansion with expensive silk works, but your ministers don't even have enough material to complete their uniform. That's your mistake number three. And finally, Chen Rao said, you don't care about money, and the ministers care about their lives. And yet, you are reluctant to give out what you undervalue, but you ask us to give out what we value. How do you expect us to work with all our strength? Well, I guess, this remark needs no further explanation. A strong government supported by virtuous officials must first send a very strong signal about its attitude towards virtue. And it's probably more effective to start with the money. Now, the principle of proper remuneration also has a function that safeguards the government officials' integrity. Okay, safeguard integrity. There is an old proverb in Chinese. It says, it is difficult to expect a thirsty horse to guard the water. So the thirsty horse is a metaphor of a government official who cannot afford to support his family with his low official salary, and the water is a metaphor of the public resources, right? So this means that it is unreasonable to expect an official with such low salary to maintain integrity and not to appropriate public resources for his own benefit. Well, it doesn't mean that, illegal appropriation is justified. The law is the law. But the problem is, low remuneration is not a good environment that harnesses integrity. And quite the contrary, it brews an incentive of crime. Although proper remuneration is not the only way to maintain staff integrity, but it is the basics. Now, the governing principle also outlines an argument about this issue. Okay, about this money issue. It says, without proper remuneration, an official cannot maintain his own survival, nor can he support his family without breaking the law and appropriating public interest. Not breaking the law, he cannot fulfill his filial duty. Breaking the law, he runs the risk of prosecution. Not being able to support his family, hatred and complaint will arise, and the integrity that he has once valued will diminish. So from this argument, we can see that the lacking of appropriate remuneration may unintentionally put people in an awkward situation where they have to make a choice between serving the law and serving their family duty. So proper remuneration is not just to tick the boxes, but to protect integrity. So it's very important. I guess in an imperfect world where resources are limited, people always have to make a choice between survival and ethics. So when the officials cannot fulfill the basic family duty, it is neither possible nor ethical to expect them to abide by the highest ethical standard. This means that the government should make an effort to minimize the gap between the appropriate remuneration level and the actual level in order to generate an atmosphere or environment that promote integrity. So this in fact leads to our final point about remuneration, which is about the recruitment conditions of remuneration-based integrity. So the first condition is that the duties of the job must be clearly stated. Okay, otherwise there is no basis to assess performance fairly, and there's no way to set appropriate remuneration level. So that's the first condition. The second condition is, of course, to find the right candidate for the job. Now, although the above two conditions are quite obvious, they're particularly meaningful to our topic. Volume 50 of the Governing Principles points out that a smart leader will make sure that organizational staffing must always fit the job. And this reduces redundant staff and financial burden of the government or the organization in general. So in turn, better remuneration can be made to existing staff and improve work ethics. Okay, so that's why these two conditions are important. Now, from a governance perspective, this kind of arrangement makes sure that government officials have little incentive to compete for wealth with the people. The fourth principle is attracting with fair utility. The word utility here means how well a candidate can put his ability and virtue to use. Now, I suppose one common mistake here, that hinders the use of talent is that the leader may simply confuse employment with utility. You see, employment describes a broad status. Anybody can be employed, but it doesn't mean that the person is properly used. Many leaders in the high positions of an organization understand the importance of recruiting virtuous people, but may still fail. And the reason lies in the underutilization of virtuous people. The governing principles suggest two potential scenarios. One is that the virtuous people are not put in the appropriate position. And this may be caused by the possibility that the position is already been taken, but the leader is reluctant to replace an existing employee out of, let's say, personal connection or avoiding embarrassment. And in this case, the leader gives more weight to reducing potential conflict than using the right person. But that's a mistake. Using the right person for the right job is not only sensible, but ethically correct, especially when the job is a matter of public welfare. To take an extreme example, the selection of a leader of a country must be only considered based on competence, experience, and ethics, and nothing else, especially personal connection. So when the leader has failed to fit the superior people to the right position, this causes annoyance and complaint, which may lead to a loss of confidence in the leader from the general workforce of the government or the company. Now, when this happens, the government and the management will likely fail. Another scenario is where the leader has replaced an unvirtuous employee with a virtuous one, but allowing the former to remain in the organization. And this replacement will likely generate resentment from coming from the unvirtuous employees, right? And this can lead to a potential threat to the organization. In fact, this is exactly what happened to the Duke of Jin, as Confucius explained. And Duke of Jin was, he respected the virtuous. He did, but he failed. He failed to utilize them. He couldn't give the virtuous people a good working environment because he neither replaced the mediocre employees with the virtuous ones, nor did he remove the mediocre ones from the organization. And the country eventually perished. The governing principles strongly recommend that the virtuous people must be used properly. And this is because of the profound ripple effect over the rest of the country. So very similar to the effect of appropriate remuneration that we talked about earlier, the proper utilization of virtuous people by the government sets a strong signal to the rest of the society. And in turn, the government will be supported, right, by all of the virtuous people. And likewise, the dismissal of unvirtuous people will show the government's resolve to maintain integrity and deter evil conduct by the unvirtuous. So you can see that, achieving an optimal utility of virtuous people is never an easy thing to do because, there are quite a few obstacles. In volume 31, the governing principles list 7 potential obstacles. 7 potential obstacles. And many of these obstacles have been, discussed in other parts of the course for different purposes, but we will briefly repeat them here. The first obstacle is that the leader is simply too weak to maintain his ground, to dismiss the unvirtuous and employ the virtuous. And this is usually the case when the subordinates are very powerful, who dilute the power of the leader. Okay, so that's the first problem. The second obstacle is that the leader simply cannot recognize the ethical superiority of the candidates. And this problem may be exacerbated when there are dishonest and treacherous candidates, the subordinates, who intentionally block the good candidates. The third is that the government is filled with slanderous officials who mislead the leader. And this problem can be exacerbated by disinformation from the outside of the government. The fourth is that there are loopholes in law and regulation which give certain interest group enormous power over the rest of the society. And this way, they may be able to manipulate the appointment decision in their favor and block potentially desirable candidates. The next obstacle is that not only is the leader unable to recognize virtuous candidates, but also confused between right and wrong. Now, this may be because that the leader is easily fooled by dishonest people who cover their true intention with pretty words. Now, as compared to these people, virtuous candidates have no intention to do that, no intention to decorate themselves. Also, their decision may not be conventional. This may lead to misinterpretation by the leader. The sixth obstacle is that the leader simply doesn't appreciate honest advice. Okay, so that's bad. And we know that honest advice sometimes sounds very critical and difficult to swallow. So this requires a leader to maintain an open mind and a big heart to be able to welcome these honest advice. The last obstacle is that the leader may not put national interest as a priority, but is only interested in personal gain. And apparently, virtuous people would be definitely against this. So under this scenario, it wouldn't be very surprising that the virtuous candidates are dismissed and not employed. So according to our study about human resource management so far, we can say that attracting virtuous candidates is far more difficult than we think it is. Right? They're both psychological resistance from the leader, the external obstacles from certain staff, and the system itself. So one way to solve this problem, especially the structural defect, is to design a good recommendation mechanism. Okay, a good recommendation mechanism. In particular, the mechanism should reduce the conflict of interest between the virtuous and the unvirtuous employees. The governing principles suggest that those who recommend truly virtuous candidates should be rewarded. Although this is not in the scope of this course to discuss the arrangement details, we can see that this helps to shift people's focus towards virtue. And the other side of the coin is that if an employee, for some reason, recommends an unvirtuous candidate who causes damage to the governance, then he must be somehow held responsible for this referral as well. And this not only incentivizes careful screening, but also reduces agency problem during the selection process. Now, a related issue about making recommendation is what I called the neutrality principle. Okay, the neutrality principle. And this means that recommendation or referral should be made based on the virtue and ability of the candidate, not personal relation. In ancient Chinese history, people always, have spoken about very highly of one particular government official, and his name is Bao Shuya. Okay, so Bao Shuya used to work as the prime minister for King Huan of Qi. Okay, and during the earlier part of King Huan's ruling, his country was at war with a different state, which is state of Lu. And Guanzi, also known as Guanzhong. Okay, so Guanzhong was one of his enemies. Okay, so there is the state of Qi and the state of Lu. This is King Huan and Bao Shuya as the prime minister, and this is Guanzhong. So they're fighting. Okay, but Bao Shuya recognized the enormous talent of Guanzhong, including ethics-based governance, diplomacy, military strategy, and propriety. So he's very, very talented. So despite of the earlier confrontation, quite deadly confrontation, by the way, Bao Shuya recommended Guanzhong to King Huan. Okay, not only that, Bao Shuya also gave up his job, his own job of a prime minister to Guanzhong. This is because he knew that Guanzhong could do a much better job than he did. And he viewed the potential benefit to the public as more important than his own. So this is what we call the neutral recommendation. No favor based on personal relation and no dismissal based on past resentment. This concludes Lecture 7. Thank you.